Hi, this is Paul. I thought I would try something out. And, well, let's see if it works. I'm currently in the Bridges of Meaning impromptu live stream room that I set up. And I started watching the Jordan Peterson Lawrence Krauss video. I really liked the first hour, which was a lot of Peterson's story, which anybody who watches my channel knows. That's where I begin with people. And I started the second hour, and I thought it was a really good summary, and I haven't gotten too far in it. Karen Wong pointed it to me and said, oh, you've got to watch this. And I often sort of wait until I get messages from people as to whether or not I want to watch something. And so I started with it. And, well, will I do a commentary video? I don't know. I might. Depends on what's in there. But I thought it could be quite interesting listening to the thoughts of others, both you who are in the comment section, nobody's in the chat section yet, and those in the Discord server. There's not a lot of people in it right now. There's a few people in the voice chat, but let's see if anybody wants to join me, and let's see what we find.
Our dialogue was you asking me questions. I realized that I forced myself to watch our podcast. I hate it because I had to listen to myself for a lot of it. But I didn't realize how many of the ideas and things you were bringing up, if I'd known about it from your books, would have meshed perfectly. And so we can follow up on some of that discussion because now I understand where you were coming from. But let's talk about how, right at the early on in Maps of Meaning, by the way, you basically say beliefs make the world. And let me read this quote.
Now again, if you get into the first personal, second personal, that's very much where we're landing. It's this first personal. Beliefs make the world. Now there's always a subtle, well, which world, what world? But the world, then in a sense, we're having the meaning conversation.
I discovered that beliefs make the world in a very real way. That beliefs are the world in a more than metaphysical sense. This discovery has not turned me into a moral relativist, however, quite the contrary. I've become convinced that the world that is belief is orderly, that there are universal moral absolutes, although these are structured such that a diverse range of human opinion remains both possible and beneficial. I learned, let's see. I believe that individuals and societies who flout these absolutes in ignorance or in willful opposition are doomed to misery and eventual dissolution. And I learned that the meanings of the most profound substrata of belief systems could be rendered explicitly comprehensible. Let's get to that later. Let's talk about the first thing. I believe that individuals and societies who flout these absolutes in ignorance or willful opposition are doomed to misery and eventual dissolution. Do you want to elaborate on that? Because I'm shocked. It's interesting to me to hear you say that because, it goes against the grain for me. So I want to...
And why does it go against the grain? I think part of the image of, let's say, the modernistic metadivine realm is that the world is just out there and we can do as we want, and well, all of us would agree that there are consequences. Now, of course, the natural law folks are going to say, aha, this is natural law. And in a sense, it is. Yet, Krauss, along with this package that Peterson is giving, there's a sense of, there's obviously a sense of obligation that this stuff can't be flouted.
To flout these absolutes in ignorance or willful opposition are doomed to misery and eventual dissolution. Do you want to elaborate on that? Because I'm shocked. It's interesting to me to hear you say that because, it goes against the grain for me. So I want to understand where you came from in writing that.
Well, I first started to understand that what we perceive in some real sense isn't exactly material reality. And partly that's because that's actually impossible. And I mean that technically. And that's something we could go into in great depth because that realization paralyzed a number of fields. It really started to come to the forefront in many fields in the early 1960s, especially in AI.
Now, built into this is sort of already the meaning crisis, in that we are now starting to see ourselves as already constructed observers. And when we started to make machines that would be our slaves and imitate us a little bit, we discovered that we are far more complex than we understood.
Yeah.
When the AI types started to try to make machines that could see the world in some sense like we do, and then act in the world. And what they instantly realized was that, oh, there isn't just something there that we see. This is way harder than we ever possibly imagined. In fact, it's so hard that it looks like it might be impossible in some sense. So how the hell do we do it? And like, we still don't have robots that can move around the world like we do.
Sure,
Endless generations.
I'm not. Maybe it's improved. The last time I looked at this in great detail, we didn't have robots that could fold laundry very efficiently either. So
yeah, well, a lot of these so-called simple things like seeing, well, it's half your brain. It takes you half your brain to see, and most animals, like we see way better than almost all animals. Say eagles, raptors.
Really? Because we have two bald eagles in my backyard.
Yeah, they can see. Their eyes are the same size as yours, and they have two foveal spots. Eagles, falcons, they're the animals that can see better than us. But other than that, it's us. And it's half our brain. Just to see. Well, so why? Well, you're a physicist. You understand that reality is composed of levels of being, right? From the subatomic up to the cosmic.
I think what unnerves people about Peterson when he goes on like this, and what excites theists about Peterson when he goes on by this, is again this principal divide between a universe that sees us and a universe that doesn't. A universe that sees us should unnerve us. Oh, we got a couple of people in the room. Universe that sees us should unnerve us, because we very quickly begin to realize its power. And I think a lot of the change that happened in the modern problem of evil was that we suddenly began to imagine, I think, the aspirations of Adam and Eve. And now these ideas that Peterson brings along suddenly makes us less so. How are you doing, William?
Make sure I'm not muted real quick. Yeah, I'm doing well.
Good. Thanks for joining.
But yes, I didn't know how to join it first, so.
Well, you figured it out. That's good.
Yeah.
And who else we got coming in? P.F. Jung.
Hey, Paul, can you hear me?
I hear you fine.
Here, let me try and get my camera on.
Yeah, your camera's...
Hey.
Oh, there you are. Well, good.
How you doing?
I'm doing good.
Yeah, I just saw you post that. I posted that conversation in a couple of the Jordan Peterson subreddits, and it took off. So
which conversation?
I was very glad you saw it. One with Krauss and Peterson. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've watched the whole thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's keep going with it.
Cosmic. It's like, well, first of all, how do you specify the proper level of analysis? Well, one of the things that's quite interesting psychologically is that we have short words are generally used to describe things that manifest themselves to us at our level of analysis. Cat. We see a cat. We don't see a species. We don't see cat subparts. We see this cat. Well, why? Well, that's the level that's most biologically relevant to us, given our embodiment. That's an evolutionary answer. And so we see what we see. First of all, what we see a lot of is memory, but we see something that's overlaid on the world. We actually see the overlay, and hopefully it reflects what's underneath, and generally it does, and it's a hell of a shock to us when we make a perceptual error.
I think that's if you guys have a point you want to make, just raise your hand or signal me and I'll pause the video. I'm trying to figure out maybe I'm doing a grim grizz here. It's virtually not alone. But this point that, we don't see the world directly. It's sort of a Donald Hoffman point where we see opportunities and obstacles, and what that does in terms of our perception. I mean, right now we're in the midst politically of this entire, a grand experiment in that of, let's say, narrative and data. And so narrative and data are always in this fight, especially when we have these huge compressed stories that we're trying to figure out how to act in together. So I don't know.
But and then I started to learn, especially from reading Jeffrey Gray, that we also see the world within a motivated frame. And he was influenced by Norbert Wiener, who was one of the world's first cybernetic scientists, essentially, a great influence on AI. Yeah, and Gray never talked about narrative, but the frame that he described that we see, and in animals as well, basically has a point A and a point B. So we're always moving towards a goal if we're mobile animals. And I thought, oh, well, the description of the movement from point A to point B, that's the simplest unit of meaning. That's a story. And then I learned that a better story is a story about how stories transform. And so those are actually perceptual frames of reference that transform. And then I understood that if you don't...
That's interesting. A better story is a story basically about transformation. It's interesting that something deep within us desires that.
Have respect for the transformation process above all else, then you can't transform your perceptual frames when necessary, and then you can't adapt to error, and that destroys you. And so that's all part of that.
There's two bits of this I want to parse more carefully. First, the statement that beliefs are the world. I mean,
yeah,
as a psychologist, I'll accept that statement if you're talking about a psychologist, namely the human psyche. I won't accept that statement as a physicist.
Yeah, well,
because of course the physicist is the monarchical vision, and the doctrine of that is that, well, no, we're flying above the world, not recognizing again that you enter into the first personal in order to get to the third personal, and you never lose the first personal in that process. And the whole process is to try to get rid of that first personal. Who's joining us? All right, Casey. A bunch of new folks. Good.
That's where we could really have a good conversation.
Well, let's have that good conversation.
Okay. So look, it has been very difficult for scientists to describe the world in a way that isn't like that narrative, right? And so the idea that there's a tension between science and religion, in some sense, is just a statement that it's been very hard for scientists to pull out an objective description of the world, given the way we perceive.
Well, it's been easy for physicists. Not easy, but it's worked for physicists.
Oh, I didn't say it didn't work. I'm not making that claim at all. I'm saying we didn't manage it till 400.
But it's funny because work is something you throw out there, and well, what do you mean work? I mean, did it work that we were able to do all these things and build all these things, but then there's all this unintended consequence that we didn't necessarily imagine we were building?
Peterson talks about, well, if you need proof that science works, it's the atomic bomb. Exactly. But then it's like, well, then the question is, well, what do you do with that power? And should you synthesize malaria and Ebola or something like that? It's like, it works, but it doesn't tell you what to do with that work, so to speak.
Right. And it seems that works always has built within it sort of an implicit, I would say, religious, eschatological desire. I mean, the desire that built the atomic bomb was to end the war, let's say, or at least to threaten our rivals and enemies with a destruction that would bring them to end the war. But then, of course, technology is this kind of thing that, well, now suddenly the Russians have it too.
Yeah, right. What are the intended consequences? Paul, is it possible, would you be able to share your screen so we can follow along on Discord? Because right now I'm following along separately on YouTube.
Yeah, it's a bit hard to
share my screen.
We don't hear it coming through the screen.
Oh, you don't hear it coming through the screen?
No.
See, this is why I play with this stuff. Yeah. I can do that.
Yeah, even just the audio would work.
I'm reminded of that Ian Malcolm phrase from Jurassic Park. You know, it's like, it doesn't matter if you could, should you have done it, you know, or something like that. I don't know. He said it, Jeff Goldblum said it so much better than anybody could, but, you know, in the line from Jurassic.
It was something like, you get so worried about whether or not you could, you didn't consider whether or not you should.
Yeah. And that's what I think about with the atomic bomb. I mean, you know, people still curse, you know, some of these scientists to this day because of their involvement with that project. And I'm not sure that's, you know, it's obvious they weren't alive in the 40s. So,
well,
it's always that's the question we had on the Discord the past couple of days is Telos. We were talking about John's project and what he's up to, and it's like he says there he doesn't need a narrative for these things, but it's a lot of us have been saying one will be given to you if you don't have one. If you don't have a Telos, something will just come in and you'll be pulled towards it and you don't know what it is.
Well, and
something's just going to come.
It's really hard to have a project without a telos, because it's in fact the telos that allows the group to all come together to have this. And I made these 2 videos on joint attention that I did, that I released yesterday. The entire thing is embedded in joint attention so that we can all act, hopefully, in together towards this telos. And what amazes me in many of these conversations, I haven't found the words for it, is what are we looking for? What do we want? We want everything, and the only word we have for everything is in some ways God. And so that we're just back in religious language. Okay, I'm going to try and turn the sound on, and hopefully we won't get an echo.
100 years ago.
Exactly, and I think we talked. This is something.
Good.
Is that working?
Good.
Okay.
Yep.
Something we talked about before, actually, that we both agree about. That science is hard, and I don't mean hard in the mathematical sense.
No.
In the sense that it goes against the grain.
That's right. It's unnatural.
It's very unnatural.
Yes.
And if we didn't, we wouldn't need science if it wasn't unnatural. I mean, everyone would be a scientist if it wasn't. And instead, so that.
Okay, so that's an insight into that issue. So then the question is, well, what is it that science as a technique struggles against? Well, it struggles against the fact that we see everything through a value-laden lens. And I mean see. Well, here's an example.
And there again is the point. There's this value. I have a real hard time imagining a value without some kind of telos in there for us as human beings.
Right. And Peterson's whole point is evolutionary determined a priori value structure. After so many millions of years or billions of years, that's what the Piagetian idea of the behavior, the mode of being that allows you to rise along the greatest number of hierarchies is that mode of being that was selected for by consciousness, so to speak. And that's what is, in a complex term, is at the bottom of our a priori value structure. And Krauss gives him some good pushback in the later ones. So this is a fun one.
Okay.
Look, when I'm looking at you on this screen, there are almost an infinite number of things I could be looking at. So first of all, there's each pixel insofar as I can see pixels, but then there's all the combinations of pixels, right? And there are a lot of combinations of pixels. And I could concentrate on one hair on your beard, or I could concentrate on the blurry cupboard behind you, or that book, or it's endless, but I don't. I look at your eyes, and you look at my eyes.
Yeah, sure.
And you look at my eyes because you've made a value judgment that there's nothing more valuable during the course of this perceptual exercise than looking at my eyes.
And again, we look at our eyes because our mind reading is very much on what are you paying attention to. I mean, every mother, every school teacher, if you want a child, give me your eyes.
And that's a biological judgment.
Well, yeah. Well, when you say a value judgment, that's interesting. Let me take
Here's
that.
why.
Again, I'm a neophyte, so I mean, I've read a lot, but I wouldn't describe it as a value judgment. My understanding is that infants are hardwired to look at eyes, and there's an evolutionary reason
no problem,
for it, right?
Man. There's values that are hardwired. That's no problem.
Why do you call them values?
Because, look,
it's interesting that he sort of differentiates the values from the newborn, as if, I mean, this is someone who wouldn't make any objection to evolution, as if we're not in fact, and the world isn't in fact. This is one of the great points Sam makes to John Vervaeke, that values are being created as we go along. It's inevitable.
To segregate out a particular element from a background of elements, I have to make that primary. I have to make it most important, and the other things less important.
Okay, so that's what you mean by value.
It's technical idea. It's like you have to look through the world. You have to look at the world through a hierarchy of value. There's no way to look at the world without doing that.
Okay, you could take an economic attitude, which you look at the world, what's most effective, what gets
fine.
The results most quickly.
That's
and
fine.
Looking at eyes is certainly, if you're dealing with humans,
pragmatism. Yeah, effective for. I mean, again, there it is.
Right.
Humans looking at eyes gets you where you want to go.
Well, and here's why. It's like our eyes have evolved the whites, and the reason for that is because the fact of the whites make it much easier for us to see where eyes are pointing. And what that implies is that all of our ancestors who had eyes that weren't easy to see either got killed or didn't mate. And the reason that we want to see where people point their eyes is because foveal tissue is extremely expensive. And you're not going to waste it looking at something useless. And so that if I can see what you're looking at, then I know what you're interested in. Then I know your value structure for that moment. I can understand you. Plus, I've been directed to the valuable part of the visual landscape. And we're unbelievably good at that. It's part of a shared reference. And kids have that extraordinarily early, as you already pointed out, unbelievably early. And so
it works. So evolution has picked that out.
Okay, so when I say value structure, I mean a decision about the hierarchy of importance.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean it in some sense, both economically and evolutionarily. There's nothing about this that's not nailed down, especially into evolutionary theory. Yeah. It's like there's a reason we.
Oh yeah, no, I'll buy that.
Yeah,
I mean, okay.
So, I think that's the value hierarchy issue.
So the value hierarchy, and when you say that, so when you say beliefs are the world, you're talking about psyche. That namely, beliefs are related to values and some. I mean, when you say beliefs are the world, I still want to.
You would be hung up on that.
Go back to that. You're saying as a human being.
Yeah, well, it's partly because
the world
we can be wrong.
What was that?
Well, it's partly because we can be wrong. Like I may think that something's important and look at it, but I might be so wrong. Like I'm driving down the highway and I focus on something and some car hits me and I'm dead. Well, that's kind of why it's a belief. It's like, well, I believed that was the best thing to look at and there was evidence to support that, but man, it was really wrong. It was wrong. And so part of its fallibility, that's partly why I refer to it's not only that. There's more to it than that.
I guess my way of phrasing it would be thinking about it is that beliefs that the world conditions our beliefs. Namely, we continually reappraise our beliefs, and the world tells us which beliefs are, if you want to call.
It's interesting how world is personified. Go ahead, William.
It seems to me that I can, a pragmatic case for when you're looking at something isn't always the eyes, though, even though Peterson seems to reflect that. I know why he's saying it, but, if I'm looking at a object of sexual interest, I'm looking at her hips or her chest, I'm not looking at her eyes necessarily all the time.
You're going to get in real trouble for that.
Yes. If I'm looking at a big juicy steak, it might be because I'm hungry and it might be just with disinterest. So sometimes our attention is used wrong. So.
Oh yeah. And it's sort of the eye of our mind I mean, we have that kind of subtlety with each other where we might be looking over here because we're all the time mind reading, we're paying attention, but inside, our attention is someplace. And even though we're always playing those subtle games with each other, that's true.
Yeah, and that's his whole point about truth-serving life is, well, I was looking at something on the highway, and it was the wrong thing to look at. So in some sense, it was the wrong belief. It's like, okay, that goes back to the pragmatist. And to the thing about looking at hips or a steak or something, I think that goes back to it. It's in any moment, what is the, where should attention be paid that serves life? And so, you can think about reproductively or food or any of that and stuff. So that's all part and parcel of that highway example, I think.
Yep. Oh, here comes Chad.
Beliefs, which beliefs are reasonable and which aren't by, I might
by
believe
killing
that I can
us.
walk out. I can walk out this window, but the world pretty well tells me no, that doesn't work, and then I don't reproduce. But although it's too late, I already have. But so I guess I think of the world as conditioning beliefs rather than the other way around.
No, it does. Oh yeah, that's fine, and it does, and that's a very, what would you say, an eternal philosophical dilemma, because you can look at it both ways. So the existential psychologists, for example, taking a page from Heidegger, one of them made the presumption that we lay values on the world, and the other made the presumption that values reveal themselves to us through the world. And they're both right. They're both equally right. You can look at it either way and it works. So, and for the reasons that you pointed out. So, but you see, it's not so clear always where the objective reality is. So, for example, you can train rats to produce a dopamine surge to an electric shock. Okay, so the shock is punishing, right? Yeah. Generally, punishment will bring behavior to a halt.
Yeah,
but if you pair the shock with a reward, but now that's, intensity of shock matters, but it can be a pretty good shock. If you pair the shock with a reward frequently, then the shock becomes positive. And so there's a good example, even in a rat, where, it's a shock and that's an objective reality, it's electricity, but the valence of that can be shifted by learning. And so there is this interaction between the psyche and the objective, well, in the domain of value. And the thing is, so for an astute perceptual psychologist, the best one is An Ecological Approach to Visual Perception. It's a great book, hard-nosed book. Doesn't really go into narrative in any direct sense, but is very much.
It's interesting that Peterson seems to be footnoting more than he did in the earlier waves. That's a point that Vervaeke would often make about him, that he needs to footnote more, and he in fact is footnoting more, which I think is a good thing. Helps people who want to sort of backtrack and do some of the reading themselves, do it themselves. So
much akin. He was one of the founders of modern perceptual psychology, the person who wrote that book. And he said, with children, we don't see a cliff, we see a falling off place. And even 6 months old, 6-month-olds see a falling off place. They also see beauty. They see symmetry. A lot of this is deeply wired, right? But still malleable, right? It's still malleable by learning. So, and that's partly why there are these archetypal values, because they're built into us biologically. And then if you flout them, well, I can give you a quick example of how flouting this is catastrophic. Well,
when he kind of snuck in the archetypal values, that's a big that's a big thing, because
the physicists aren't a fan of that language.
Well, and when you start talking archetypic values, you're talking whole narratives, whole sets of narrative, narrative worlds that are connected with our world, that we trigger, we participate in, etc. Good to see you, Ginger Bill.
Right, and the
good evening.
His point earlier about archetypes, like the archetypal hero is when he speaks about it from an evolutionary sense, that is that mode of being that is selected for across hierarchies, right? The archetype of the hero is that which can rise up many iterated hierarchies, which I think is, I think that's the best way to describe archetypes to, someone like Krauss versus more the mystical Jungian type stuff. But
so, part of the strange question, I suppose, is what exactly are we interacting with? And you might say, well, it's the material world. And I would say, no, not exactly. What we interact with is more like a field of potential. Now, we resolve that pretty quickly into perceptual objects, but it really is a field of potential because it can go one way or another, and somewhat unpredictably.
Yeah, and you talk about that.
Yeah, and consciousness... it's strange. Consciousness snaps that into, the being that we perceive anyways. Mm-hmm. And so it's a field of potential. And so you can kind of experience that. You wake up in the morning and you think, what am I going to do today? And what you're saying is, I've got these degrees of freedom, weirdly enough, and if I act a certain way, I hope these things will happen as opposed to these things. And so what presents itself to you in the morning, you've already seen your damn room. You don't even look at it really because you've memorized it. Well, what you perceive in the deepest sense is this field of potential that you can interact with.
Yes.
Okay, now the issue is, what's the best way of interacting with that field of potential? Well, think about it collectively. Okay, you and I are having a discussion right now because you can think and I can think, but we think differently. Now, we're hoping that if we exchange thoughts, that we'll be able to master what's coming at us better. And hopefully we will be able to. Now, Imagine we shut that down.
That's part of his rule. Imagine the person you're talking to knows someone that you don't. If you actually don't believe in that rule, you won't bother talking to anyone.
Well, then we can't interact with what's coming at us better, and it'll kill us. Mm-hmm. And so that's partly why free discourse isn't an option. It's not different than thinking, and thinking isn't different than dying. So that's one example of why the West has elevated free speech to the highest place, even religiously. That's the divine word, essentially. And that's the idea lurking underneath that. It's like everything else is dependent on that.
Well, that's intriguing to me because, we both have been speaking out about free speech in various ways lately. But one of the things that was intriguing to me that never hit me, and you just sort of, it relates to what you said, and I was talking about this recently to actually Stephen Fry, but it came to me from watching a speech by my friend Christopher Hitchens, who said that the problem of censorship, the problem of cutting down free speech, doesn't just the saddest part isn't that you're infringing on the rights of the speaker.
No, that's not. That's bad.
But you're infringing on your own rights because you lose the opportunity to learn that you might be wrong.
Yeah, well, and that's fine if you're already in paradise and you already know everything that you need to know to make your life just how it should be. That's no problem. But if you've got some problems, well, maybe you should listen a bit because...
Well, even if you don't, the point is if you shut down others, you really lose that opportunity to learn, even if what they're saying is reprehensible. You are at least forced to ask, why do I believe what I believe? Why do I know they're wrong? And maybe they're not wrong. And that is a right. So in some sense, you fringe upon your own rights more than others because you lose that opportunity to learn
Absolutely.
your wrong.
And it's, of course, dependent on whether or not we have ears to listen. Because a lot of what's going on is just yelling, which is, of course, the little one inside of us that wants to have its way in the world. But there has to be the humble self to listen to our enemies and maybe learn from them.
Not only that, but you might not be able to even locate your enemy.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. There's no doubt about that. Look, one of the things I really learned from Carl Rogers, even though I talk so much, was the importance of listening. The vital, vital, vital importance of listening. And I've met many, many people in my life who no one has ever listened to, not even once. And, if you listen to people, they unfold. That's the secret to Rogerian psychotherapy and Freudian to some degree, because he let his people free associate. It's like, if you just you listen, because then they watch while they're talking how your face changes. And then maybe you ask them, well, I didn't understand that. And so they're thinking, and they're on that edge, And they're putting themselves together, not metaphorically, man. This is, they're reorganizing the internal chaos right in front of you. And that's part of what's so fascinating about being a clinical psychologist, because you get in that groove and it's so remarkable.
And it's really a shame he can't do that again. I mean, maybe he'll be able to do it again. I hope so.
Yeah. Paul, I just want to point out here, he said there's people that have literally, or he says, no one's ever listened to them, not even once. Like that type of stuff, it's like, I can understand why people, when they hear Peterson talk, it's like, okay, see this guy, he just kind of throws things out. It's like, obviously someone has listened to them technically in some sense, but he kind of plays, or I don't know, he puts the meaning in terms of, no, I mean listen as in like listen in a real sense, but then he'll say it and it sounds kind of, and so I get why.
It's hyperbole.
There's that gap. Yeah, right.
The literal internet has a problem with the non-literal.
Yes, right.
Again, that kind of goes to what I'm saying. Like, if you want to chalk up your experience with Peterson to, like, really, like, what is that? Like, kind of like almost like legalistic thinking around this stuff. I mean, I don't know. Like, I think it's ridiculous, but part of that is I think it's good because it's supposed to be kind of that reciprocal opening, right? A little bit of frame breaking on other people. Like, well, why does that bother you?
Right.
You know, I went through that before. You know.
The criticism I hear constantly is his number one, his thing is be precise in your speech, right? And then he'll say things like, well, Elon Musk made a car and that's basically, or an electric car and that's basically impossible. And it's like, well, I mean, you get that, but there's a lot of stuff you kind of have to really be charitable and interpret. And so I don't know. I think it's interesting for the rationalists to Paul's point.
Do you think he means precise in that way? Like, in what way does he mean precise? Because Peterson he's not a modernist scientist. I don't think that's the way he's using precise. I don't want to say that he's trying to get at the spirit of what he's communicating in the most precise way, but because, he talks about, I think this is it, because he says, I will never teach something in the classroom that you can't use in real life. And I think that's what he's trying to be precise about.
Well, I mean, if everybody took Peterson like literal and serious, we'd all be walking around with our shoulders back and our whatever, that first rule. We'd all have terribly bad posture because of it. I mean, this is ridiculous. I think that it's kind of what he's doing. He's doing this, like, stop taking yourself so seriously. Like, pay attention to what's important here. And then if you notice you're arguing about something as petty as, well, he's saying be precise in his speech, but he said, this or that. It's like, I mean, he's highly obviously skilled at talking with others who are just like the kind of people that would be bothered by a misuse of a word. You know what I mean? So, like, he's obviously using techniques.
But not just that. Like, I think the word precise is not being rude. He wasn't precise about using the word precise. Like, as if you ever done this with kids, you tell them, okay, can you make me a peanut butter and jam sandwich or something like that? You ask them to do this and do them step by step, and you follow the steps, and you'll notice they aren't being precise in what they're doing because there's loads of built-in assumptions about it. Even as a young kid, like, kid can already do this. Like, okay, what you need to do, we need to get some bread. Okay, fine. And you need then put the peanut butter on the bread. It's like, okay, I'll put it around the sides on the crust. That's what you meant, right? Because it's very ambiguous, but we have so much built-in context that we don't need to be extremely precise, like as in we're talking to a computer. It's this embedded information already there, but also not the same point is that you're not talking to a machine when you talk to someone. You've got this person you're talking to. They can think for themselves to a certain extent, and being precise is it's the wrong word. I think he just means, as he tries to say what you believe and don't Don't be afraid of it, effectively.
Say what you believe to be true as best as you can. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, we see a lot of this kind of like legalistic, like pointing out, oh, what do you mean by real, or what do you mean by proposition, and all this different stuff. I was talking with Joey about this earlier. It's like we're so caught up on this stuff, and it's an old spirit. I think it's a similar spirit that you would have. We do this with theology. We do this with religious beliefs. Like, it's like, gosh, why are we so silly? I'm not saying I'm above this, because I've had so much difficulty with this kinds of like rigid thinking, and it just leads to like the world being so small that I can barely fit in it.
It's what's so fascinating for me by doing these podcasts, which is different for me. I'm used to expounding for most of my life, and learning how to listen effectively and get people to. It's really, for me, it's been a fascinating thing to do, and that's one of the things I'm enjoying right now at this very instant. By asking you questions that you can free associate about. Okay, I think we've beaten that horse about belief and where you come from to death. I may come back to it elsewhere. Mm-hmm. But the second part of that is what I find fascinating: that you that you believe that you've convinced that the world that is belief has universal moral absolutes, and that if you ignore them, and individuals or societies ignore them, are doomed to misery and eventual dissolution. It's interesting to see how much we'll get through here, because we're just at the beginning. But I find that again, it's something that doesn't resonate with me at all. So why don't you expound on it a little bit?
Well,
no moral absolutes. Okay.
No, I know where Krauss is coming from, but it's like he's let's put it this way. He's mixing a few concepts together and he doesn't even realize it. Let's put it that way. I can explain a bit later, but yeah.
No, explain it now. So where is he coming from?
So he.
Uh-oh. Did we lose you, Bill? Oh, he was just ramping up.
Yeah. It says green on Discord, but...
Can you hear me now?
We hear you now, Bill.
Okay, sorry. I think I have a dodgy connection. Doesn't matter. Right, back to it. As I was saying, Lawrence Krauss is one of those... He's a new atheist, but he's the weird one of the new atheists. And especially that he's willing to speak to people actually of completely different things and actually consider their viewpoints. Especially he's talking to Peterson like this and such, which is very different to that crowd. So when he's talking about worrying about objective values and such, Peterson's being still very scientific about saying, yes, there's an objective reality. If you have certain values and they lead you one certain way, it's going to leave you in bad places compared to that value. So you can have completely still be, there's no objective value. I hate this term, but as in there's no real values, I should say. There aren't real moral things in the world. Just things like, if you do this, then there's going to be certain things. But Krauss is going yeah, but I'm but doesn't that mean that this is the problem is Krauss is going to, I'm trying to find the best way of phrasing this. Sorry, it's really hard to, again, be precise in your speech, but it's really hard to do this, is that he is trying to frame it in a way that, the way I do it in my head, this is not going to help some people. He's trying to bridge the Azort gap, but he can't. And he thinks he can. That's what I mean, Krauss. So as in he thinks you can look at nature and look, they're the objective values. I can see them. They're over there. But he's coming from that standpoint and is then talking to Peterson. He's but they aren't what I mean by values. I mean, their values, that's objective values there in the world. It's Peterson's Peterson is making that split. And Krauss is getting confused by the split, I think, in my opinion. And he can't wrap his head around the split.
Well, the split is, so if you use Wilfrid Sellers, who basically has his is-ought split, narrative is in a sense this bridge, because you can't have narrative without both in many ways. And when we have narrative without nouns, it becomes completely uninteresting to us, and you lose the idea that ought in many ways develops its power from the nouns. Oh, there he is.
Yeah, everything's got working.
Good. So no, you're right, and so this is of course where we're going to get at, and I think if you begin with the first personal, and you get to the third personal, there's always, I mean, all of this speech, all of this wrangling is motivated. We cannot.
Oh yeah,
it's always motivated. We can't speak and have it non-motivated. So, but I really appreciate his first talk with Krauss. I didn't think Krauss performed very well at all, but I really appreciated what Krauss did in the first hour. And so far, the second hour and 20 minutes is looking quite productive in terms of, I think, helping Peterson be more precise in his speech, and I think explaining himself better, which...
Yeah, and I think one thing for Krauss is that he is actually quite smart. This may sound horrible to say, but many of the YouTube new atheists aren't that smart. They're just like smart enough to do all these, I don't know, do basic logic, and then they just don't understand their own view. But Krauss is understanding a lack of understanding, and he wants to understand that, which has probably helped because he's a scientist in that regard, actually an actual scientist. So he's actually helped, like, okay, I don't understand what this guy's saying, but most people like him. He seems to be coherent, so I want to learn more. So I think that's where Krauss is coming from, which is why he's weirder of the new atheists, one I'm going to say. I'm not saying he is unique, but he is different.
Good.
I could give you some examples, I guess. So, and these are like pointing to narrative substructures, let's say. Well, when I look at what's happening on the far left edge, what I see is an existential issue. So here's the existential issues. There's the tyrannical father. There's the benevolent father. There's the tyrannical mother. There's the benevolent mother. That's 4.
See, there was the benevolent mother. She was just in the picture.
Synchronicity.
Well, I met his parents when they were in Sacramento, and they're absolutely lovely people. So,
and we can easily become obsessed with any one of those. Well, you get obsessed with the tyrannical father. Well, that's an existential absolute in some sense. And the reason for that is that, well, we're historical creatures, right? So we have a culture. It's often viewed as a patriarchy, and that's one way of looking at it. And it definitely has its evil edge. I mean, and everyone to some degree suffers from the guilt of history. That's privilege, right? It's like, well, do you really deserve what you have? I mean, you didn't invent all of it, and there's people who maybe are just as worthy as you who don't have the same stuff. And, what about European invasion of North America, let's say, and et cetera, right? And so that's an existential absolute. We always have to contend with the tyrannical father. Well, fair enough, but there's another half to that. And if you just get obsessed with this one thing, you're so off balance that you're not gonna fix the problem. You're just gonna make it worse, because you don't have a sufficiently, in some sense, even a sufficiently random view of the world, randomized. Let's look at it that way. Your sampling is off in a major way. And so then, well, and that tyrannical father, let's say, that's also something really easy to identify with. That's what happens when people become authoritarian. And there's a shadow to that. And so that's part of, and if you ignore that, well, then your society becomes totalitarian. And it's like, well, good luck to you. It's like, we've seen.
Although moms can be pretty totalitarian too. I mean,
that's what he's been recently more talking about, like the feminine aspect of totalitarianism. Yeah. And he talks about like social media is the antisocial behavior is more similar to that of like adolescent females than males, because it's more verbal, and so that's an interesting arc.
Yep.
What happens when that happens? And there's a difference between a totalitarian society and a free society, and the difference isn't trivial, and it's associated with value, and what's at the top, at the highest place.
Well, you said more. Didn't use value. Use the word moral, which is intriguing to me. What do you mean by morality?
Well, morality basically is the difference between good and evil, fundamentally. And so that's how I'm defining it.
Okay,
and so,
okay, that's what I wanted.
You might say, well, is there evil or is there good? And I know that's a complicated question, but at some point there's an answer to that. So here's how I answered it for me. Well, you can be dubious all you want about an ultimate good. But there are things that have happened.
There's a lot of jumping in there. It's a hard question, but
Happened in the recent past, the last 100 years, that are so terrible that I defy you to look at them and say they're not evil. And then you have to think very carefully, if you say that they're not evil, just exactly what are you saying? And so then I invert that and say, well, I don't know what good is, but it's the opposite of that. Right, and that's a good starting point, right? It's like, I don't know.
It's interesting that this is nearly Vervaeke's reciprocal broadening and reciprocal narrowing. Vervaeke basically makes the exact same argument.
Yeah.
This
And I also was struck recently reflecting on like this common argument that Peterson has about Nazism that has to be evil. What's the opposite? Isn't that basically Sam Harris's argument? Like,
I was just going to say.
Yeah, it's the exact same argument. So I think we do have to keep that in mind as well.
And Peterson's point is that argument's a narrative, going back to the narrative idea.
Yeah, because I think that's the key. Because once you realize that, you have to ask, okay, what were Sam and Jordan arguing about in Vancouver 1 and the podcast before? And I think it is that Peterson wants to ground this in a narrative as opposed to Sam who wants to ground it in material reality. And that's a very important distinction.
It's whatever takes me farthest away from that. And this was a personal thing for me to some degree, because when I was wrestling with the issue of atrocity.
So when you get into Christianity now, good is whatever takes Jesus furthest away from the cross, which is exactly what Peter wants to say to Jesus when Jesus says, this is where we're going. So these are very interesting ideas.
I'll just get St. Augustine out, just saying, yeah, it's furthest away, evil's furthest away from the good. That's all it is. Privation of good, if you want to use his term.
That's right. Well, now we're
That's
playing with Neoplatonism.
Yep.
And this is what I think this is one of the things that made me different from most people who think about these things. I didn't think of
I think there's lots of things that make him different.
myself as concentration camp victim. And I didn't think of myself as, Schindler.
Yeah.
Or the Dutch family that hid Anne Frank, because that's pretty bloody unlikely. It's let's do some stats here. I thought of myself as resentful concentration camp guard.
Okay.
And that was quite shocking to do that. Yeah, well, it's like, are you a victim or a perpetrator? Are you a hero or a perpetrator? Well, I can tell you for sure that you are at least in part a perpetrator. Mm-hmm. And if you don't understand that, then if the temptation to become a perpetrator arises, you won't know how to withstand it, and you may even want it. And you think, well, I wouldn't want that. It's like, oh yeah, really? Is that right? Do you really know yourself that well, do you? And you actually know what happened in Germany, do you? And the steps that people took. Read Ordinary Men. That's a great book. Talk about step by step. That's a great book, man. And those were ordinary guys. And they weren't particularly reprehensible. But what they did, it's like they were taking pregnant women out into fields, stripping them naked and shooting them in the back of the head. You think, oh, I couldn't do that. It's like, yeah, okay, maybe. And you think you wouldn't enjoy it. It's like, yeah, maybe. There's a lot more in there than you think, unfortunately. So
this is Peterson the preacher.
Yeah, Protestant preacher Peterson, yes.
Yeah.
Front the shadow.
Yeah.
Bring up Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the hierarchy of value. Like, that is embedded inside a framework of good and evil. There's no way around it. It's part and parcel of it. It's way out at the fringes. And so when I talk about what's religious, so imagine there's a hierarchy of value. And here's how this hierarchy works. The deeper the value, the more other values are dependent on it. So that's the definition of deep. Mm-hmm. When you look at the deepest values, you are in the religious domain, psychologically speaking.
Well, okay. Again, explain
Yeah.
that. You often
Well,
say
it's
things,
part-
and the word and yeah, and I
well,
need
we
to
got to
understand
think
what
about
you mean.
that's we got to think about this experientially, and not. I'm not talking about propositional description.
First personal, not third personal.
Yeah,
Well, actually,
I'm talking
can
about
make a
something
point
different.
about what he just said about the deeper the value, the more other values depend on it. There's a good business analogy. It's like if you're a business, you might say customer service is our primary priority, our primary value. We're going to have customer service be what dictates everything. But that has to be limited by something. You have to have a limiting principle. And so for business, it's like profitability is that deepest value. And, that has its issues and whatnot. But the idea is, well, if you can do something sustainably and still do it, that's what undergirds everything. And so anytime I think about that hierarchy of values and, at what point, this is kind of and this is something that happens on the left is like, when you talk about like inclusion or, diversity, inclusion and equity is the three buzzwords. It's like, well, inclusion in and of itself can't be a value because eventually you're going to include so much that you include people you're not trying to include, right? So I think that's that hierarchy of value idea put into those practical terms has always been useful for me.
You equate religion to biology throughout, at least in many places.
Yes,
and to mythology, which I
absolutely.
find. Yeah, I know, and it's something I have to get over because
That's
I find
okay. It's hard.
It's
hard, man.
Well, it's not just hard. I find it sort of. I guess for me, it diminishes the argument. I mean, you say, oh, you really say, I learned that the meanings of the most profound substrata of belief systems can be rendered explicitly comprehensible, even to the skeptical rational thinker. And then you say, and to me, this is sort of naturally turns me off because you say the world as a form for action is composed essentially of three constituent elements, which tend to manifest themselves in typical patterns of metamorphic representation. First is the unexplored territory, and I'd say fine, but then you automatically go to mythology as if it has some. You say the Great Mother, nature, creative, destructive, sources of final resting place of all determinate things. Second is the explored territory, the Great Father, culture, protective and tyrannical, cumulative and ancestral wisdom. Third is the process that mediates between unexplored and explored territory, the divine son, the archetypical individual,
hero,
creative, exploratory world. We are adapted to this world of divine characters as much as the objective world. You are, and I see that you I mean, the whole point, as far as I can see, of a lot of what you're saying is something that on the surface seems straightforward.
It would be horrible if you didn't object to all that.
Well, I object.
You should.
But I object to it. One of the reasons I object to it by nature is to say, well, it seems obvious that myth, to the extent that there's any universality of various myths, and the fact that it goes back a long way, is intimately reveals aspects of the way humans thinking evolved. Evolutionary psychology and myth are related. Okay. That seems obvious, but I don't know why one needs to make more of it than that. I guess the question is, why describe
I don't think you need to make more of it.
What more of it do you think he's talking about there?
I don't know when he says, I don't know why you need to make more of it. It's like, well, if you just said that myth can reveal the structure of the psyche, essentially, it's like evolution, produced these myths, and the fact that there's commonality across myths, the archetypes, has implications. It's like, why would you not make more of that? It's like, well, because we're trying to figure out important things. I don't understand his intuition when he says something like that.
Yeah, I would want to listen to more of it, but I feel a lot of religion W tensions here, because a lot of what we've done in this part of the internet is expand the definition of God, of religion, expand the definition of religion and worship too, and that can be a really big allergy to people like Krauss. Right. So I think that's part of what's going on here.
And it's interesting because a lot of the new atheists whose primary objection to religious thinking is fundamentalism taken to its radical extreme or something. And it's like, well, and I think John McWhorter talks about like woke racism or wokeness as a religion. And it's like, well, if your goal, going back to like, what does it mean to be work? What does it mean to be effective? Like, what's the pragmatic purpose? Is like, if the new atheist objection to religious fundamentalism is because of its negative outcomes, well, wouldn't you want to then see where echoes of religious thinking find itself in things like wokeness or even, devoted atheism, so to speak, because it's as destructive. So putting that in their own kind of pragmatic value framework is interesting, because I would think, yeah, of course you'd want to see wherever there is religious extremism, so to speak, broadly defined, you want to address it, but they want to keep it into that, well, really don't change the words, because it's, we spent our whole lives talking about this.
But like the new atheists, it's not against religious extremism per se, but more like fundamentalism, because I would say the vast majority of new atheists were brought up as Christian fundamentalists of some form and Christian materialists as well. So when they became new atheists, they didn't really change their metaphysics at all, or their ethics, or any of that. All they started realizing was that, oh, that thing I start believing doesn't make any sense, and it's stupid and silly, and all these people are believing it, all they're stupid and silly. But then if you see like the new atheists, they were very much against, they would say Islam or just radical Islam. And mainly they were viewing it from their Christian standpoint. But regardless of that, just even to keep on just the Christianity part, when you see the new atheists, the people they were arguing with were the fundamentalists. They're pretty much their old camp where they came from. And they were just arguing against them. And it's like, because effectively they were of the same group. They're part of the same tribe, effectively. Just one was like, hey, why stop thinking about this way is bad. This is just stupid thinking, yada, yada, yada. But one of my favorite stories about like Richard Dawkins is when he was having a conversation with, at that time, the Archbishop of Canterbury, which was, I think it's Rowan Williams or whatever, I can't remember his name. And he didn't even see the irony in his statement. It says, I was talking to Rowan Williams, and Rowan Williams was able to answer what I was about to say and actually understood my position better than I did. But he says, then why and he was literally, he said this seriously, then I don't understand then where he doesn't take my viewpoint then. And the irony was lost on him, clearly, but it's like, no, he understands your view really well, clearly better than you. Yeah, there may be a reason he doesn't believe in your view. But that's kind of the disconnect here sometimes, is that they think their view is correct, obviously. It's like, it's obvious it's correct. What are you talking about?
I'd love to see Dawkins and Peterson have a conversation. That would be
well, Peterson really hasn't done. I'm anxious to see. I know that he's recorded this conversation with Sam Harris already, but he hasn't really done particularly well in that forum. I don't think the forum is terribly productive, and I hope what he says he has learned in terms of other ways to have conversations might be more fruitful. I've found, a lot of it depends on what your goal is. And this is a huge problem with Christian evangelists and pastors. What they really want to do is dunk on people. And in my experience, people who get dunked on continue to be your rivals or enemies. And if you actually want to influence someone, why don't you try befriending them, understanding them, and associating with them at a whole variety of layers, and then see what kind of conversations you might have and where that might go.
Yeah, but all the free internet points, you get internet points for dunking on those people, don't you? Oh,
Reddit karma.
Oh, crap. I'm
Reddit karma will get you to heaven.
I need to totally redo this whole thing I've been doing.
Yeah. Upvotes, like the stream.
Martin Zarathustra, he made his comment, and I think this is sort of one of the key things that Peterson brought in, is the credibility of mythology for public metaphysical conversation. Because part of what happened in modernity was, well, people are having conflicts over metaphysics, so let's take them off the table. Let's sort of keep it to the lower register, and we can stop killing each other. That's not a bad thing. But Peterson comes along and says, is there knowledge? This isn't dissimilar from some C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield. Is there actual knowledge in the mythology? Can we know it? What are the implications of that knowledge?
Than that's quite a lot right there.
There's a lot of it, but I don't know why one needs to make more of it than that. I guess the question is, Why describe
I don't think you
everything
need
in
to
terms
make
of-
more of it than that. That's
Well,
quite a lot
there's
right there.
There's a lot of it right here. There's a whole book.
Well, yeah,
about
I'm trying to unpack it. So, well, I'll give you an example. This is,
Okay.
I mean, the examples are quite nice. So, the Egyptians viewed Horus. Now, remember, they're trying to figure things out. They're trying to figure out how to assemble a very large state, and they're trying to figure out what should be sovereign. So they're trying to.
And it's interesting that when they're trying to figure it out, they're not sitting around the table and saying, now we're trying to assemble a very large state.
An evolutionary process.
It's all this trial and error and, let's kill all these people. How'd that go? Well, their kids are trying to kill us now. Okay, well, maybe let's not do that.
It emerges, right? And then it meets the spirit that it's trying to instantiate.
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
right
yeah.
In the middle, it meets, and then there's your myth.
One of my favorite connections that Peterson makes is the story of Horus. Is it Osiris that gets cut up, right? And the world is made out of, or I think Osiris gets cut up and his body is scattered around the world. And he makes the same analogy with Tiamat, right? The hero, I think it's Marduk,
cuts up
kills
Tiamat. Yep.
Yeah, and his point in Beyond Order is that our prehistoric ancestors, when they would hunt mammoth, would build like shelters out of mammoth tusks. And it was kind of like, well, how many hundreds of thousands of years or how many, millions of years of something like that then gets mythologized. And it's like, well, and then again, that goes back to the hunter is the hero archetype and it's all tied up. And I just think that's interesting from the evolutionary perspective.
I think part of what modern people struggle with is, in fact, the precision of much of the technology that we have surrounded us by. And that's where we tend to look for magic words, and even our imagistic, our images of magic are Harry Potter. It's boom, boom. It's cause effect. It's all direct. Whereas with many of these things, there's huge masses of things going on, and sometimes this works, and of course, probability arises.
Mm-hmm.
To figure out, well, who is this pharaoh and what should he embody and how should he act if things are going to work? And they're doing this for like thousands of years. They're trying to puzzle this out, and they're using their imagination. And so they parse out their patriarchal god into two forms. There's Osiris, and he's the old state. He was once a hero. He was pretty good, but he got archaic and ossified, turned to stone in some sense. So, and he has a son, Horus. Now, Horus is that Egyptian eye. And everyone knows that eye. It's the eye. Why the eye? Well, that's
it's also so interesting how we and he has a son, and it's like, okay, well, what is a son to a father? And how does that, because I deal with this all the time in terms of, I find Christians, Jesus is the Son of God. All right, well, what do we mean by that? And now if you have sort of a monarchical imagination, the son is the prince. And all sorts of things flow from there. But I think I either didn't hear it or went through most of my whole life not having anybody ever pause and ask, what does it mean that Jesus is the Father's son? It's in some of the parables, but there's so much just packed into here that in many ways we are experientially divorced from it.
falcon, because falcons can really see, and so Horus was also a falcon. Okay, so what the Egyptians were doing was worshiping attention. Okay, so now what does that mean? Well, attention isn't the same as thought. So when you're listening in these podcasts, when a podcast's going real well, you get into it and time disappears. Okay, it's because you're attending. Right? Okay. And what you're attending to, fundamentally, you're on that edge where you're willing to let the things that are ossified about your cognitive structures flex. Okay. And you're expanding yourself out into unexplored territory. And that's way better than being right. It's way more fun than being right, although being right protects you from being anxious. Not eventually. It doesn't work eventually. But being on that edge, well, we're adapted to that edge. I mean, seriously
certainly
adapted to it. Yeah, well,
I certainly am.
well, everyone is. Although this
and even this dynamic, I mean, being right has a certain rest to it, but this sort of connects up with a flow state, and we sort of lose ourselves. And what do we mean by that? We're no longer conscious to ourselves. We are completely attentive, and we're lost in that attention.
Let's say the breadth and intensity of that edge is much different between different people, and where they find it for them differs with their temperament. Mm-hmm. But you need everything about your beliefs needs to be subordinate to the process of transforming those beliefs, unless you already know everything. And so that's just one, and that's played out to some degree. You see that to some degree in Christian symbolism, let's say, where there's a tension between the Son and the Father. Yeah. And the Father is more, this is what is. It's already established. And the Son is more, well, wait a sec. Yeah, but there's this horizon of possibility that we have to contend with, so this needs to be updated. And that's a very...
I'm not sure he's getting that from the New Testament.
I was going to say, is that Old Testament, New Testament dichotomy?
Well, the Son...
Well,
go ahead, Richard.
What that brings to mind for me is I just started Jonathan Peugeot's conversation with Styx.
Oh, yeah.
And Peugeot makes the point that part of what Christ was doing is saying, look, this old system is passing away, and we need to make some changes. So, I mean, I agree that, I don't know where he's getting that from, and two, I don't know if I would characterize that relationship in that way as the main importance of it, but there is certainly something there.
Yeah. In the New Testament, the Son is always serving the Father, but he's part implicit in serving is also doing something in terms of the mission of the Father that it is required, that there is need of a Son to accomplish. In other words, there's a necessity of what Jesus does that is played out in the drama of the Trinity. So
it's a tough thing for human beings because, well, it's a lot easier just to go with what you...
Go ahead.
Yeah, would that be a parable? What parable is this? The parable where there's a guy who owns, not an orchard, but like where you grow grapes.
Vine dressers?
Yeah, and then the people, like...
That's what I thought of too.
The father sends his son to like, okay, got it.
And they kill the son because they're like, oh, if we kill the son, then we can own the vineyard. And, of course, anybody listening to that would be like, no, that's not going to go that way, which is the point of the parable.
But we just don't know enough. So we have to subordinate that to this process of exploration, that creative, and that, I believe that's encapsulated fundamentally in hero mythology. Hero mythology is about transforming ideas. That's essentially what it's about.
I'll buy that, but why? I guess if one's trying to explain...
Hero mythology is about transforming ideas?
I think so, because if you think of the hero's journey, that's effectively what it is the hero goes out and gets new things to change.
But isn't it about transforming both the hero and the world through the hero? It's not merely ideas.
No, well, I think Peterson is saying that he's mapping that onto ideas.
Okay.
Right.
That
explain something which you're talking about now, which I find fascinating and can relate to. What utility is there in reverting to the myth?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, partly it's the same utility that there is in me using an example to describe what I meant.
But you're right. And the example, and I find when you write,
well, that was sort of a micro
more compelling when you talk about, say, and I used to find the same thing about Oliver Sacks and other, but more compelling when you talk about your experience as a clinical psychologist, which is something I can relate to, than when you talk to me about the great father or the tyrannical mother or the hero. Or
it should be more compelling, because the problem with those, say, low-level abstractions is they lack concrete embodiment. So I'll give you an example of that. This is a weird example, but it'll work. Mircea Eliade, he's a great historian of religions. And he was cognizant of Nietzsche's proclamation that God had died. And Eliade knew what that meant and what the consequences would be. But he went back when he was doing his pioneering work into the history of religion. He said, this has happened many times. This is not the first time. Why? Well, what happens is a community comes together and forms some representation of the summum bonum, right? The thing that should be on top, the ultimate good. Yeah. But gets so damn abstract that it doesn't connect to life. It's like, well, that's God, but what does it have to do with me, like interacting with my wife or doing something embodied and practical? It gets so abstract it floats away. No one has any relationship to it anymore, and it dies. But that's not good for a variety of reasons, which we can get into. Well, part of the way that the Christian imagination addressed that problem, speaking psychologically, is to take that abstraction and make it incarnate in a particular time and place. And it pulls the story down to earth. And it makes it much more compelling. A student once asked me, look, if there's all these archetypal structures, why don't we just tell the archetype over and over? And I thought, it has to be particularized. It has to be optimally particularized for imitation. That's why.
And all along the horizon, all along the diversity and and human experience. And of course, that's exactly the role of a pastor, of a church, that's why you have, Peugeot in the Styx conversation, Christianity is an initiatory religion. It has to come down. It's not enough that it just comes down from Jesus, and that's why Jesus sends the Spirit. And in a sense, what he's saying, it has to come down through all kinds of people, sort of like in the way that in the first Matrix movie, an agent can sort of come through any other character in the Matrix.
I'm sorry to butt in, but it's...
No, that's your job here, to butt in.
No, yeah, but for a view is that I think we don't deal in abstractions or generalities very well. We deal with specifics and particulars. And when people try... Let's take something to my field in programming. People try and abstract the problem away so they don't even know what they're dealing with. And just like, what if I need to do with this thing or do this thing or what thing in the possible future? It's like, well, what's your problem right now? Just do that. Just do it right now. Just solve that one right there, that specific thing. But people always try and abstract even further. But the other problem is that once you've gone abstracted, you've completely forgot what you're doing, is the first thing. And it's usually going to be bad. But the thing is once you have these specific or particular examples, you can then start seeing the generalization of it. You can see the pattern emerge. And then you can apply that pattern elsewhere once you know it from this experience.
Right.
But I think that's the kind of thing is that Peterson was saying in general, is that when you only have the pattern and not seeing where it's come from, and you're just applying it randomly, literally like dogmatically is the best way of putting it. It's like, well, then it's like, why do I need this? I'm just going to chuck it out anyway. Like, I don't see where it came from. So when you have this grounding, and again, it seems to be very, it is pretty much not unique, I would say, but not. Well, actually, no, it's a lie. Let's take Hindu religions. Let's take, I'm trying to think, Krishna, or any of the other avatars in general. They are an instantiation of the god of Vishnu into this world. And it's like, yeah, it has to be. Like, otherwise, if it's completely abstract and they're just there, people don't really know how to tie on there. And I know Krishna's only one of the avatars, obviously. I don't know how many there are. I'm not much of an expert, or even that much than there. But like, you need this specific things to know the generality in the first place. You can't. That makes more sense there. So talking about the archetypes in themselves is going to be really boring and too generalized, and you're not going to get any useful out of this. It's the specifics is when you get the nuance and the insight.
And there's like you can feel or see sort of the subjective area. The example I always go to is, I mean, in movies, right? Like Lord of the Rings, battle of good and evil, demons versus wizards, very archetypal, right? Not going to help you necessarily know how to, solve a business problem. But then you can go all the way to the bottom. Like, I'm a fan of Succession. It's the TV show about, business basically. And it's like, well, that's not wizards and demons, but every scene, there's still archetypal elements in every scene. That's what keeps you interested. And then you can have something in between, sort of that, well, completely, real world, no magic, wizards and demons, and then you get that like borderline, like the example I use is like Silence of the Lambs is like, well, it's in the real world, but it's like right on that border of like, Hannibal Lecter's like, evil in not a magical sense, but almost a magical sense, and that's that archetype playing through at different levels, and some are more. To Paul, to your point, is like, depending on what your circumstances are in life, what you're going to relate to. Well, that's where the archetype needs to present itself through is a personal situation that you've had experience with that you can then interpret this in. And Lord of the Rings and stuff, well, no one's been in that, demon Mount Doom or anything, but it speaks to us at one level. But then, if someone's, like I said, Succession, which is about business or whatever, okay, cool. That's something I can at least interpret a little bit differently.
And the only reason why the abstractions and the archetypes are compelling is because we're already bathed in all of these stories. Because let's say I had never heard a story in my life, and Peterson goes on talking about these tyrannical fathers and whatever. Because I don't care. The power of the archetype is that I have all of these things that I've already listened to, and then Peterson presents me with this archetype and says, this is a lens that you can interpret all of these stories through, and you can get the information inside of the stories through the lens. And that's why Peterson's biblical series is so powerful, because I suspect that one of the reasons why people keep deconstructing our Christianity is because the Bible, what's it good for? It's not teaching me anything. It's not providing insight into my life. And the reason why it isn't is because the lens we're using isn't allowing us to see the information in there. So why Peterson is so powerful is because he allows us to get the information out of the things that we've already been bathing in. And it's the same for Peugeot, too.
So you just made me realize something as well, which is a good point. The archetype itself, you can these are a specific thing in themselves. Like, they are allowing you to extract the background noise from a story, and then you can see the particulars, obviously. But in a sense, this, even if you tried to do the archetypal story, you would still go specific. So it's actually impossible to have a general thing anyway in the first place. So even if you tried, but even if you were, you're still being specific about it. So it's kind of like you always got some way of a lens of to interpret the world with. Always, you cannot have this value-free, outside the universe way of looking at the world. You've always in the world, experience it and interpreting it in a certain way, and you got that lens. You're right. Sorry, I think it was a very good thing, Richard. Yeah.
Just to let you guys know that I'm going to wrap this up at 5, so we've got 9 more minutes.
And so if I get too abstract, you don't know what it means for perception or action, and it loses all significance, and you drift away. A good storyteller, he knows his audience, and he can put the story on the edge of their cognitive transformation. And then it's absolutely...
And that's similar to the zone of proximal development that a parent does. But you have to be highly contextualized. And, with preaching, when you teach preaching, what's the first thing you need to do in order to preach? Or to do any speech, you need to know your audience, because you're going to be doing this, applying. And, part of the reason that I have been tried to be so focused on building communities like this is the only way this has power. And the only way that actually what we're doing right now works is because we've had this community and you all know each other a little bit, but now suddenly, you can come together and I can just open up this room without worrying. If I just did this on the open internet, I don't know what we'd find.
Dangerous.
But you all have been vetting each other for a while now, and you have reputations and you have standings, and we know some of our stories to a degree, and in that way we can actually be productive with each other.
Absolutely captivating. But it means the archetype or storyteller, he knows his audience, and he can put the story on the edge of their cognitive transformation, and then it's absolutely captivating. But it means the archetype has to be particularized constantly and re-particularized constantly.
Well, it's another way. I mean, I guess that's often you frame things in a way that I think is a fancy way of saying something that maybe I'm just too pedestrian. I would just say, that I've said before, teaching is seducing, car salesman is seducing. If you want to get to people, you have
teachers should be really careful with that word.
Yeah, that's going to be a lawsuit waiting to happen. Yeah.
Don't bring up Epstein.
That's right.
Yeah.
Be a little careful with that word.
To go ask where they're coming from, and you have to tailor your arguments to where they're coming from so that they can emotionally relate. Isn't that just the case? Isn't that what you're saying?
Well, I'm trying to explain why those things are seductive.
Okay,
So
but why? Okay, they are.
Because that's the thing. It's the experiential issue, and that's also relevant with regard to the notion of religious depth, which we should just take a quick side step into.
We're going to go there eventually anyway. So yeah,
because it's a technical issue as far as I'm concerned, because I'm trying to speak psychologically. So when you start to toy with the deepest values upon which all these other values depend, that has an embodied consequence. One is it's deeply upsetting. Mm-hmm. So it's anxiety provoking. The other is it's deeply wonder provoking. And those are both there. And the reason they're both there is because, well, you blow apart that base level map and all sorts of things fly out of Pandora's box. And some of those things might kill you, but some of those things might be just what you need to solve your current problem. So it's tense.
I think when he talks this way, and this is where some of this new atheist literalism comes in, and I always had the same impression. So I grew up, and you listen to the story, you listen to Genesis 3 in the garden, and God says of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. And as a kid, I read that, and it's like, I can understand poison fruit, die. They didn't die. They didn't die the same day. What's going on with this? And I think, a big part of Peterson's theme is that, again, you poke at these things and you toy with these things at your own peril, but that peril might take generations to work themselves through. And again, I think in our mechanistic imagination, well, I did this and nothing bad seemed to happen. It's hard to tell.
When you speak at religious depth, there's an embodied consequence of that. It's independent of any discussion about, religious propositions as logical statements about the structure of reality. For me, most of that's beside the point. It's like, you don't.
But for me, most of it's not only beside the point. Most of it's irrelevant.
Yeah, well, it's irrelevant to what we're discussing because there are depths.
Most of it's silly.
Yes, and there are depths.
Put in. Right. So the reason why I find this with the new atheists is that usually many of them, like even Dawkins, which I find this is weird that they're so very good at evolution and such, but they usually don't realize that some things in evolution you can't get rid of them, and they're actually necessary. So let's say you're doing this, make this up, say it was a religious practice, and they're doing this thing, and it just seems like from an outside, like that's absolutely silly. Why do you need to do that? Just get rid of it. The rest of it will still work. And it's like you don't know why that's there. It's kind of tagged along, and it actually may be necessary for something in the future or something else, or even maybe like, oh, you don't need to do the singing or anything like that. You can just talk it and give like the sermon. That's it. Just it. Why do you get rid of the singing? You just get rid of it. That's silly. And it's like, that's what they're viewing, is they're seeing that they can take these parts away and don't realize that no, It's a complex web of things that all join together, and maybe yes, they are silly when you look at them on their own, but maybe they're even if you're using the atheist framework, they're still necessary for it to function. But there's the problem: is that this is usually the flaw of most atheists I've seen, is that they don't think of it like that way, even though they do it in other areas, and I find that quite fascinating. They don't think of religion like they do their own scientific systems.
Right.
Like it's like Peterson's point about I think he said he had a friend who was like, well, we should. Christmas doesn't make any sense. We can rationalize away. He's like, well, you can do that all you want, maybe have a perfectly logical argument, and then what happens? You lose Christmas. It's like, what's the point of that? So
yeah,
that's fair.
I mean, like Christmas is. I always find this weird as a grown up because Christmas was always a big thing in my family, and even though I was brought an atheist, let's put it this way: my Christmas is a really big thing in our family. All the family come around, everything. We do the biggest meals, all loads of presents, everything. It's a wonderful time of year. It's magical is the best way of putting it. And if you got rid of that, it would be horrible. And there would be other things that you wouldn't do anymore as a family. So you could say, yeah, but it's stupid. Many of you don't even believe in all that stuff. Like, why would you do it? And it's like, because look at what it actually serves the function.
Right.
Like it, and yeah, you could get the other things like, for instance, okay, why do you have to put a Christmas tree? Can't you just put it like on the floor? That's fine. Put the presents on the floor. You don't need them under a tree. Why do you have to put these baubles on a tree? It's like all these weird things when you see it as silliness. It's like, this is the problem, is that when you're trying to view from this kind of third person, I hate this. I don't really like this terminology using Paul, but I'm going to keep to it because you're using it. But third personal view, it's like, yes, everything looks silly. Everything is very surreal, but it's like, but the problem is you're trying to analyze it on its own when it's part of a system. And you're part of that system. That's my, sorry, that was my butting in. Done.
No, you're here. I can do this by myself, as all of you know. It's much more fun to do it with you.
Mm-hmm. The problem is I'll have the tendency of doing what you, Paul, and just kind of ramble and say my thoughts aloud. I think that way.
You've got wonderful thoughts, Bill. Well, to me,
sure about that. I've got quite a lot of bad thoughts as well. Don't worry about that.
Yeah. Well, to me, it goes back. I've mentioned this a few times too. That amazing video where there's a little. They're comparing the chimp learning and the little girl with all the stick tapping on the little mechanism, and the chimp looks at the person tapping the stick, and it's like, that's dumb. I just grabbed the treat. And the little girl just keeps tapping, and we might think, oh, relevance realization. Why is that girl so stupid? Oh, no, that girl is playing a different game. That little girl is connecting with the giver of the candy. The chimp is in it for the short haul. The little girl's like, I want to inherit the candy. I want to inherit the candy giver.
That's the thing I would say differentiates one thing, not the only thing, but one thing differentiates humans from animals. That we fundamentally have this idea of doing long-term delayed gratification.
Yep.
So I'll unbundle that for a second. So a dog, you can train a dog to stop and say, hey, give him a treat. You can train him so he doesn't have the treat until you tell him. But the thing is, the dog isn't doing that naturally. Like a squirrel isn't burying his nuts because he's thinking, in the future, I'm going to have to do this because they made me food. Like that's instinctual, obviously. But humans we can plan years in advance and delay ourselves. Okay, I'm not going to buy that thing today because I won't have any money. But if I wait up and save up and do this, I can then get it because then I want it for whatever reason. It's like, this is rational, purposeful driven. I mean, when I say rational, I mean it is purposeful, as in it's towards an end. And we are delaying our gratification. Like we could have that chocolate right now. But I'm like, yeah, but then you start getting a few pounds. And it's like, yeah, but come on, it's really good right now. But no, it's not good for you in the future. And you're playing for this. But maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think animals really think that far in the head. They may do small levels, but they're not planning like, okay, big societal things. And that's what religion helps as well. It's like helps you to do this. Yep. Like that's why there are religious calendars. And it's quite funny seeing it now, like seeing all secular ones. They're now just putting new religious calendars in there. It's like, even in the UK now, they're putting this Black History Month. And I'm like, why have we got this American religion now as our holiday? It's like, wait, what? Like, why do we have to have a Black History Month? Like, it makes no sense. But it's a religious calendar. Yeah, every month is now got a different thing. Like now, look, we're still in Christmas. It's okay, but next month it's going to be something else, and it's like it just keeps coming.
Everyone believes in some religion, but some people just don't know what religion they believe in.
Yep, pretty much.
All right, if you do not have a telos,
go ahead.
one will be provided for you.
Yes, that's right. Well, this has been fun, guys. And for those of you in the comment section, thank you, Rick. Thank you, Anselman. I know Grim Grizz was like, "There's no wrenches in the comment section." Oh no, what's going to happen? Nothing terribly bad happened. So
Cool.
these guys are more experienced on the internet than I am. So I will end